They slapped me with a $20,000 fine, accusing me of hoarding water with the dam I built on my own land. This wasn't just a dam. It was the one thing I built to feel peace after my wife passed away. The HOA president ordered me to get rid of the water, threatening to take my home if I didn't. So I gave her exactly what she asked for. But what that power-hungry Karen didn't know was that her own greedy secret was sitting right in the path of the flood she just ordered. Where are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments, because you're about to see what happens when a bully meets the laws of physics. And if you believe that every HOA president needs to be reminded they don't own the ground we walk on, hit that subscribe button, because this is the kind of justice they never see coming. The first 3 months after my wife Annie passed, the silence in the house was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I tried fixing things in my workshop, tinkering with the old tractor, but my hands just felt stupid. The grief was a physical weight, pushing down on my chest until I couldn't draw a full breath. One afternoon, I was walking the back 40, down in the gully where a little stream used to run before a decade of droughts turned it into a dusty scar. Annie and I had always talked about bringing it back. "Water is life, Rick," she'd say. "This land is thirsty." Standing there, staring at the cracked earth, I finally felt a flicker of purpose. Building a dam wasn't just a project. It was a way to start breathing again. I'm a retired Army engineer. I spent 30 years designing systems to hold back rivers and shore up failing infrastructure in places most people only see on the news. This was different. This was for me. It was for her. I drew up the plans myself. Nothing huge, just a low-head dam, reinforced concrete with a simple gate system. The goal wasn't to stop the water, just to slow it down, to give it a place to rest and let the earth drink. I went down to the county, sat with a nice woman at the Water Conservation District, and walked her through my hydrology reports and structural designs. She stamped my permit without a second thought, said it was one of the most thorough private applications she'd ever seen. The local inspector came out twice during construction, nodded his approval, and said it was a textbook example of solid erosion control. It took me the rest of the summer, mixing concrete, setting rebar, and shaping the earth with my old front-end loader. The day I closed the final gate and watched the winter runoff start to pool, it felt like the land took its first deep breath in years. By spring, I didn't have a dam, I had a pond. It was clear and cool, maybe 10 feet at its deepest. The willows on the bank greened up first, then the cottonwoods. Deer started coming down to drink at dusk, their fawns stepping carefully at the water's edge. Bass and bluegill appeared like magic, and soon the air was filled with the croak of frogs and the buzz of dragonflies. The erosion that had been clawing away at the bank near my workshop just stopped. My nearest neighbor, Marty, a retired Navy Seabee who knew his way around a toolbox, came over with a six-pack one evening. We sat on the tailgate of my truck, watching the sunset paint the water orange and purple. "You did a good thing here, Rick," he said, and that meant more to me than any commendation I'd ever received. A few other neighbors brought their kids by to fish on weekends. The laughter echoing across the water was a sound I hadn't realized I'd missed so much. For the first time since Annie was gone, the property felt like home again. It was peaceful. And then, the letter arrived. It came in a stiff, cream-colored envelope, with the HOA's logo embossed in the corner. The return address was just a few streets over, in the newer, more tightly packed section of the development. I'd never had any dealings with them. My 40 acres were on the edge of the community, grandfathered in with a different set of covenants, or so I thought. I figured it was just the annual newsletter. I opened it at the kitchen counter, and the words felt like a slap in the face. A $20,000 fine. The letter was signed by a Janice Wilmer, the new HOA board president. I'd seen her once or twice, a woman with a stiff haircut and a sour expression who drove her golf cart around like she was patrolling a prison yard. According to her, my dam, my pond, my memorial to Annie, was an unauthorized hydrological obstruction. It was too large for residential use. And the most ridiculous part? She accused me of hoarding water. Hoarding it from what? The dry gully it was healing? The aquifer it was replenishing? The whole thing was nonsense. The letter ended with a demand: drain the dam immediately, or face escalating daily fines and further legal action. I read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an attack. It felt personal, predatory. I spent the rest of the day in my workshop, digging out my files. I found the county-stamped permits, the inspector's sign-off sheets, the detailed engineering plans, even the receipts for the rebar and concrete. I put everything in a neat manila folder. Reason, I told myself, had to win. This woman, Janice. She was probably just some bored retiree who'd spent too much time in a city planning office and thought she knew better than everyone else. She just needed to see the paperwork. She needed to be shown, calmly and professionally, that she was wrong. The next HOA board meeting was that Thursday. I got there early and took a seat in the back of the clubhouse conference room. The air was stale with the smell of cheap coffee and entitlement. Janice Wilmer sat at the head of a long table, flanked by a few other board members who looked either bored or intimidated. One of them, a woman named Laura Fenwick, kept glancing nervously around the room. I waited patiently through the droning discussion about lawn violations and trash can placements. Finally, Janice opened the floor for new business. I stood up, holding my folder. "Ma'am," I started, keeping my voice level. "My name is Rick McAllister. I received a letter from you regarding the pond on my property, and I've brought the county permits and inspection approvals to clear this up." Janice didn't even look at my folder. She looked right through me, a thin, smug smile playing on her lips. She picked up a small gavel and tapped it once on the table. The sound was a sharp, dismissive crack. "That is not on the agenda," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You are not a recognized speaker at this meeting." I stood there for a moment, stunned into silence. A few people turned to look at me, a mix of pity and discomfort on their faces. I opened my mouth to protest, to say that this was a $20,000 issue that deserved to be on the agenda. But she cut me off before I could speak a word. "This is a closed session for board discussion only," she announced, though a dozen homeowners were sitting right there. "If you have a grievance, you can submit it in writing. Now, if you'll please sit down." Her eyes were cold, daring me to challenge her, and in that moment, I realized my mistake. I had come here expecting reason. I brought engineering documents to a knife fight. This wasn't about water or rules. This was about power. And I was just told I had none. I walked out of that clubhouse, feeling like I'd just been sucker punched in slow motion. The sheer arrogance of it. To be shut down so completely. To have my evidence dismissed without a glance. They wanted it in writing? Fine. I could do in writing. I spent the next morning composing the most professional, meticulously documented letter of my life. I outlined the entire project, from initial soil tests to final inspection. I attached photocopies of the county permit, the state water code compliance forms, and the signed-off inspection reports. I even included a topographical map, showing the minimal impact on the watershed. I laid out the facts, clear and simple, assuming that even a person as unreasonable as Janice Wilmer couldn't ignore an official paper trail from the county government itself. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, so there would be no question they received it. For about a week, there was silence. I started to feel a sliver of hope, thinking maybe their lawyer had seen my package and advised them to quietly drop the whole thing. I even called Dave Henderson at the county water district, the man who had originally reviewed my plans. I explained the situation, and he let out a long, weary sigh. "Some of these HOAs," he said, "they think they're their own little government. Tell you what, Rick, I'll send one of my best guys out there to do a fresh look, just so you have it in writing from us, dated for today." The next afternoon, a county truck pulled up my drive. A man named Frank, with hands like leather and a lifetime of sun squinting his eyes, got out. He looked at the dam for all of 5 minutes, walked the spillway, and checked the water level. He kicked a boot against the concrete base. "This is a textbook example of erosion control, Mr. McAllister," he said, spitting a bit of tobacco juice. "Matter of fact, it's better built than half the municipal culverts in this county. Does its job, holds a good reserve for the water table, and doesn't bother a soul. You tell that HOA of yours that if they have a problem with this, they have a problem with the County Water Conservation District." He wrote it all down on an official field report, signed it, and handed me a copy. That night, I scanned Frank's report and emailed it to the HOA board's official address with a simple subject line: "Supplemental documentation regarding F 2023 DAM." This, I thought, was the final nail in the coffin of their ridiculous claim. Checkmate. Their response came 3 days later. It wasn't a letter of apology. It was a second fine notification. They had not only ignored the county's official report, but they had also enacted the penalty clause from their first letter. I now owed them $20,000, plus an additional $100 per day. The new total was already $21,500. They were doubling down. That's when the harassment started. They sent a compliance officer to monitor the situation. His name was Chuck Bremer, a beefy guy with a cheap security guard uniform and a palpable thirst for authority. The first time I saw him, he was standing just on the other side of my property line, holding a clipboard and pretending to make notes. The second time, he was bolder. I caught him trespassing 50 yards onto my land, snapping photos of my barn with his phone. I walked out to meet him, my old German Shepherd, Duke, growling softly by my side. "You're on private property, Chuck," I said, my voice dangerously calm. He puffed out his chest. "I'm a compliance officer for the Homeowners Association," he said, as if the title meant something. "I have a right to inspect for violations." I took a step closer. "The sign at the end of my driveway says, 'No trespassing.' That applies to everyone. The next time I find you on my land, I'll be calling the sheriff to have you removed." He smirked, but he backed away, his little power trip punctured for the moment. 2 weeks passed like that. A slow-burning fuse of anxiety. I'd see Chuck's car parked down the road, or I'd catch the glint of binoculars from the trees. And then I went to check my mail. Tucked inside the metal box was a thick, legal-sized envelope. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from the county clerk's office. I sat in my truck and tore it open, a cold dread washing over me. Inside was a notice of lien. The HOA had taken their manufactured fine and filed a legal claim against my property. The document stated that if the debt was not paid or the violation, my dam, was not cured within 90 days, they could initiate foreclosure proceedings to force the sale of my land to recover their money. My land. Annie's land. The home we built together. The 40 acres of peace I had left in this world. My hands started shaking. I felt the air leave my lungs, that old weight settling back onto my chest, heavier than ever. For the first time in years, since the night the doctor told us the treatments weren't working, I broke. I just sat there in the cab of my truck, the engine off, and let the grief and the rage and the helplessness wash over me. They weren't just fining me for a dam. They were trying to take everything. That evening, I didn't go into the workshop. I just walked down to the water's edge and watched the sun go down. A doe and her fawn came to drink, their reflections perfect in the still water. The sound of the frogs starting their evening chorus filled the air. This place was alive, and it was mine. It was all I had of her. The HOA board didn't see life here. They saw a violation. They saw a line item on a ledger. They saw a man they could push around. As the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the hills, the grief inside me started to cool, to harden into something else. It was a cold, quiet anger, the kind that doesn't shout. It calculates. Janice Wilmer wanted to wield authority. She wanted to dictate the terms. She wanted the water gone. And as I stared at the dark water, I whispered to the empty air, to Annie, to myself, "Fine. You want the water gone? You'll get it." The decision settled over me not with a crash, but with a profound, chilling calm. The fight wasn't over. It had just changed. I turned and walked back toward the house. My steps sure and steady, but I didn't go inside. I went to my workshop, the big steel building where I kept my tools and my plans. I flipped on the overhead lights, the familiar buzz, a comforting sound. In the far corner, covered in a thick canvas tarp layered with years of dust, was a large steel assembly. It was the original gate release mechanism I had designed for the dam, a more complex, robust system than the simple manual one I ended up installing. It was over-engineered, with fail-safes and remote actuation capabilities. I hadn't needed it. It was too much for a simple pond. Until now. I grabbed a corner of the heavy tarp and pulled. The canvas slid to the floor with a soft whoosh, revealing the cold, precise steel beneath. My workshop became my sanctuary. During the day, I kept up appearances. I mowed the lawn, worked in the garden, and waved to neighbors just like always. But when the sun went down, the lights in the workshop flickered on, and I went to work. The plan in my head was simple and elegant. I wasn't going to destroy my dam. I was going to perfect it. And in doing so, I would give the HOA exactly what they demanded, in a way they could never anticipate. I started by reinforcing the dam's main wall, not because it was weak, but because I needed it to be flawless. I drilled into the existing concrete and epoxied in new lengths of rebar, then poured a secondary facing, tying everything together into a monolithic structure that could withstand 10 times the pressure it would ever face. While the concrete cured under heavy tarps, I focused on the gate mechanism. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, powered by a hydraulic system I'd built from salvaged tractor parts. The release was tied to a remote-controlled servo I could activate with a simple encrypted signal from my phone. Fail-safes were built into every connection. If the power failed, the gates would lock in place. If the hydraulic pressure dropped, they would lock. Nothing would happen by accident. This was about precision, control. The same thing Janice Wilmer thought she had. My friend Marty would come by some evenings, a brown paper bag with a couple of cold beers in his hand. He'd watch me work, the glow of the welder hiding the worry in his eyes. He never asked what I was building. He just seemed to know it was necessary. "Heard some whispers down at the hardware store," he said one night, leaning against a workbench. "Janice and her crew are getting mighty ambitious." He told me the HOA board was pushing a new special project, a private clubhouse and picnic area, to be built down in the gully, the same gully that my dam's runoff naturally flowed through. "They're talking about grading the whole area flat," Marty said, shaking his head. "Bringing in a bunch of fill dirt. Didn't sound like they were too concerned about permits." That information slotted into place in my mind, like a final critical puzzle piece. They weren't just attacking me. They were clearing the way for their own project. A project that would almost certainly be illegal and dangerously short-sighted. They saw my pond not as a violation, but as an obstacle. The harassment continued, a steady, low-grade campaign of intimidation. Chuck, the compliance clown, would park his car at the end of my road for hours at a time. One afternoon, I caught him trying to fly a cheap drone over my property line. The drone's signal mysteriously cut out, and it dropped like a stone into a thick patch of blackberry bushes. I never saw it again. Another time, I found a small trail camera strapped to a tree on the back path leading down to the water. I took it down, removed the memory card, and left the camera sitting on the HOA's welcome sign at the neighborhood entrance. At the next board meeting, Janice escalated her rhetoric. A neighbor later told me she spent 20 minutes warning residents about the dangers of unlicensed water hazards and rogue construction projects, painting me as a menace to public safety. She was building her narrative, making sure everyone saw her as the hero and me as the villain. A few days later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I drove out to the small cemetery where Annie was buried. I pulled a couple of weeds from around her headstone and sat on the grass beside her. The stone was simple, just her name and the years of her life, with a small inscription at the bottom. "The water is wide. I can't cross o'er." It was from an old song she loved. I talked to her for a long time, just like I used to. I told her about the dam and the frogs and the way the light hit the water in the morning. And then I told her about Janice Wilmer and the lien on our home. "They've turned our peace into a war, Annie," I said, my voice thick. "They want to take this place, but I'm not going to let them. I'm going to finish this." It wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about protecting what was left. It was about drawing a line in the sand, or in this case, the mud, and defending it. I felt a sense of resolve settle over me, a quiet certainty that I was doing the right thing. The work was finished a week later. The new gate system was installed, calibrated, and completely invisible from the outside. The reinforced wall was stronger than ever. The dam looked exactly the same as it had before, a peaceful pond shimmering in the autumn Sunday. But now, it was also a precision instrument. That evening, I sat down at my computer. I pulled up the HOA's official email address. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment as I chose my words carefully. I didn't want them to be emotional. I wanted them to be official, clinical. I typed, "To the Board of Directors of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. This letter serves as formal notification of my compliance with your repeated demands. The obstruction you have cited will be removed. The dam will be emptied as you requested, effective at 7:15 p.m. on the evening of your next scheduled board meeting, Thursday, October 19. Please ensure any residents or property situated downstream of the natural watercourse are notified accordingly." I hit send. The email was a declaration. It was my acknowledgement of their authority, my surrender to their demands. And I knew, with absolute certainty, they would read it as a victory. They would see it as proof that their campaign of fines and threats had worked. They had finally broken the stubborn old man on the back 40. And in their arrogance, they would never once stop to consider what "as you requested" truly meant. They wouldn't check the weather forecast. They wouldn't consult a hydrology map. They wouldn't even think to look at their own unpermitted construction plans for the new clubhouse. They would just show up to their meeting, smug and victorious, ready to celebrate their win. They wanted the water gone, and I was going to give it to them. The night of the HOA meeting, a heavy autumn rain had been falling for 2 days straight. A real soaking rain, the kind that saturates the ground until it can't hold another drop. The pond behind my house was full, pressing gently against the newly reinforced concrete. It was perfect. I arrived at the clubhouse at 7 o'clock sharp. The crowd was bigger than usual. My email had clearly stirred up some interest. I found a seat in the back corner, same as last time, and just watched. Janice Wilmer was holding court at the front of the room, a smug, triumphant look on her face. She was practically glowing with self-satisfaction. She nodded curtly in my direction, a gesture that was less a greeting and more a king acknowledging a peasant who had finally bent the knee. I just gave her a small, neutral nod in return and settled in. The meeting dragged on with the usual petty business. Someone's fence was 6 inches too high. Someone else was parking their boat in their driveway. Janice handled each issue with the condescending finality of a dictator signing decrees. I checked my watch, 7:10. The rain was coming down harder now, a steady drumming on the roof of the clubhouse. Janice finally wrapped up the old business and cleared her throat, adjusting the microphone with a dramatic flourish. "And now," she announced, her voice booming slightly through the cheap speakers, "for some very good news. As you all know, the board has been diligently working to resolve a serious safety and compliance issue concerning an unapproved water retention structure." She paused. letting the words hang in the air. I am pleased to report that the homeowner in question has seen the error of his ways and has agreed to comply with our directives. The structure will be removed. A smattering of polite applause rippled through the room. Janice beamed, soaking it in. I checked my watch again. 7:14. 1 minute to go. I leaned back in my chair, calm as a man with nothing left to lose. I slipped my phone out of my pocket, keeping it low, below the level of the tables. I already had the app open. There was just one button on the screen, a simple green circle. Janice was still talking, something about community standards and the importance of rules, but her voice was starting to sound like a distant buzzing. The clock on my phone flipped to 7:15. My thumb pressed the green circle. There was no sound, no explosion, no drama from my end. A few miles away, a silent, encrypted signal reached a receiver tucked inside a waterproof housing at the base of my dam. A hydraulic valve opened. 3 perfectly balanced, 16-foot wide steel gates at the bottom of the dam swung smoothly downwards, opening a massive sluiceway. It wasn't a dam breaking. It was a dam operating exactly as it was designed to. At first, the water flowed out calmly, a steady, powerful stream, finding the path of the old creek bed. It was elegant, controlled. It was thousands of gallons of water, moving with purpose, following the laws of gravity down the gully, exactly as it had for centuries before any of us lived here. Back in the clubhouse, nothing happened for the first 2 minutes. Then, a man in the front row looked at his phone, his eyes widening. He nudged his wife. She pulled out her phone. Then a few more phones lit up. A low murmur started to spread through the room. People were getting notifications from their home security cameras, motion alerts from their backyards. They were getting texts from neighbors who hadn't come to the meeting. The first person to stand up was a man who lived on the cul-de-sac just below the gully. "My driveway is flooding," he shouted, shoving his phone in the air for everyone to see. "What the hell is going on?" People started rushing toward the glass doors at the back of the clubhouse, peering out into the rainy darkness. What they saw sent a shockwave of panic through the room. A river, 30 feet wide and 2 feet deep, was flowing where a moment ago there was just wet grass. But the water wasn't staying in the gully. It was hitting something. It was hitting the huge, uncompacted mound of red clay-filled dirt the HOA's unlicensed contractor had dumped there last week, the foundation for their new clubhouse. The illegal construction blocked the natural flow of the watercourse completely. The water, with nowhere else to go, surged sideways. It slammed into the flimsy retaining wall the HOA had built along their primary access road. The wall, lacking proper drainage or deep footings, held for about 30 seconds before it gave way with a sickening crunch. The water poured across the road, a brown, churning torrent, and cascaded down the slope into the neighborhood. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The rushing water undermined the soil with incredible speed. We watched in horror as the driveway of a newly built spec home buckled and cracked like a saltine cracker. A brand new tool shed on the next lot tilted, slid sideways, and collapsed into a pile of splintered wood. Janice rushed to the door, her face a mask of disbelief. She started screaming, pointing a shaking finger at me. "What did you do?" I slowly stood up from my chair and walked calmly to the front of the room. I looked out at the chaos her arrogance had unleashed. Then I turned to face her. My voice was quiet, but in the suddenly silent room, every word landed like a hammer blow. "You wanted the dam empty," I said, meeting her panicked gaze. "It is." Just then, a set of headlights cut through the rain. A white van with a local news station logo on the side pulled up, its camera already pointed at the unfolding disaster. A reporter hopped out, microphone in hand. As she started speaking to the camera, I walked over to the news van's producer. I handed him a small, waterproof USB stick. "On here," I said, "you'll find time-stamped videos of their illegal construction, copies of my county-approved permits, and the email from the HOA president demanding I drain the dam tonight." He looked from the USB stick to the destruction, then back to me, a look of pure astonishment on his face. He knew, right then, that this wasn't just a flood. This was a story. By morning, the story was everywhere. The 10 o'clock news led with dramatic footage of the collapsed driveways and the muddy torrent tearing through the neighborhood. They played my interview, where I calmly explained that I was simply complying with the HOA's written demands. Then, they showed the documents from the USB stick, my stamped county permits next to the threatening letters from Janice Wilmer, my email giving them explicit warning, next to time-stamped video of their contractors dumping unpermitted fill dirt directly into a natural watercourse. The narrative they had so carefully constructed, me as the rogue engineer, them as the guardians of safety, crumbled on live television. The story went viral overnight. Veteran versus HOA became the headline on news websites across the country. My phone didn't stop ringing, but I didn't answer. I just sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and watching the aftermath unfold. The rain had stopped, and the water level had dropped, leaving behind a thick blanket of mud and debris. The access road was impassable, a testament to shoddy construction and breathtaking arrogance. The county, now under the glare of media attention, acted swiftly. An army of inspectors descended on the neighborhood. What they found was a complete indictment of Janice's leadership. The retaining wall had been built without rebar. The culverts under the access road were undersized by half, a cost-cutting measure that had doomed them from the start. Most damning of all, they found the HOA's internal documents, which showed that the board had received a hydrology report 6 months earlier, warning them that any obstruction in that gully would cause catastrophic flooding during a heavy rain. They had ignored it, fired the consultant who wrote it, and hired a cheaper, less scrupulous contractor to grade the site for their clubhouse. The community, which had been cowed into silence by Janice's bullying, finally found its voice. An emergency neighborhood meeting was called, not by the board, but by the homeowners themselves. It was held on a waterlogged lawn, surrounded by the evidence of the board's negligence. People were angry. Their homes were damaged. Their property values were plummeting, and they knew exactly who to blame. A neighbor of mine, a retired contractor with 30 years of experience, stood up and pointed toward my property. "I've seen Rick's work," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "That dam he built is more solid than anything this HOA has ever touched. It held the water back and saved us from erosion for 2 years. The only thing that failed here last night was their cheap road and their even cheaper leadership." A chorus of agreement went through the crowd. The tide had turned completely. Janice, of course, refused to accept responsibility. She went on the offensive. Her lawyer filed for an emergency restraining order against me, claiming I had committed an act of eco-terrorism. She told a local reporter that I had acted with malicious intent, deliberately trying to destroy property. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to shift the blame, and it backfired spectacularly. I hired my own expert, a hydrologist from the state university. She spent a day taking measurements and running calculations. Her report was simple and irrefutable. The volume and flow rate of the water I released never once exceeded the safe, natural capacity of the historic streambed. Had the channel been clear, the water would have flowed harmlessly through the neighborhood and into the main creek a mile downstream. "The water wasn't the problem," she stated in her conclusion. "The problem was the illegal and negligently constructed barrier the HOA placed in its path." I forwarded her report to the media and to the county prosecutor's office. Janice's counterattack had not only failed, it had given me the opportunity to legally and scientifically prove my innocence. Her restraining order was laughed out of court. The judge, after reading the hydrologist's report, looked at Janice's lawyer and asked if he genuinely wanted to proceed with a claim that had no basis in law, science, or common sense. He wisely withdrew the petition. The final blow for Janice and her board came in the form of an official county vehicle. A deputy sheriff and a man from the county planning and development office drove up to the clubhouse, which now had a wide, muddy river running through its foundation. They served Janice with a cease and desist order for all unpermitted construction. But it was more than that. The second document they handed her was a formal notice that the Oak Creek Homeowners Association, under her leadership, was now the subject of a full-scale county investigation for violations of state environmental protection laws, gross negligence, and potential misuse of homeowner funds. As the deputy handed her the papers, I was standing on my property line watching. She turned and saw me, her face a storm of rage and humiliation. She had tried to take my home, my peace, my reputation. She had used lies and intimidation as weapons. But in the end, she hadn't been defeated by some complex legal maneuver. She'd been defeated by a simple law of nature she chose to ignore. She'd been beaten by gravity. And as she stood there, holding the documents that signaled the end of her petty reign, I knew this wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an HOA that had forgotten who it was supposed to serve. The investigation had just begun, and the story was far from over. The county investigation hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud, and Janice Wilmer was at the center of the lightning. Auditors were crawling all over the HOA's finances, and county engineers were taking soil samples from her botched construction site. The pressure was immense, and it led to something that had never happened before: a mandatory emergency HOA meeting, called not by the board, but by a petition signed by 2/3 of the homeowners. The law required the board to hold it. The topic was a single line item: a vote of no confidence in the current board of directors. The meeting was held in the local high school auditorium to accommodate the crowd. Every seat was filled. The local news station was there, cameras rolling. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was a public spectacle. Janice and the other 4 board members sat at a long table on the stage, looking small and isolated under the bright lights. She tried to control the proceedings, reading from a prepared statement full of legalese and deflected blame, but no one was listening. The anger in the room was a living thing, a low, constant rumble. After an hour of residents taking turns at the microphone to detail their grievances, bogus fines, ignored maintenance requests, and now thousands of dollars in flood damage, the moderator, a neutral party appointed by the county, called my name. The board would now like to give Mr. Rick McAllister an opportunity to speak. A hush fell over the auditorium. All eyes were on me as I walked from the back of the room toward the stage. I didn't feel nervous. I felt a profound sense of calm. I wasn't there to yell or to accuse. I was just there to present the facts. I walked up the short set of stairs and stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone. I looked out at the faces of my neighbors, then I looked directly at Janice Wilmer. There seems to be a lot of confusion about what happened. I began, my voice steady and clear. So, I'd like to simplify it. I'm just going to present 3 facts. You can decide for yourselves what they mean. I paused, letting the silence stretch. Fact number 1. I held up a clear plastic sleeve containing my original county permit. The official stamp was bright red, visible even from the back row. This is a permit from the County Water Conservation District, approving the design, construction, and materials of my dam. It is a legal, professionally engineered structure that was inspected and signed off on by the proper authorities. It did its job perfectly. I set the document down on the podium. Fact number 2. I pulled out a folded copy of the hydrology report the HOA had commissioned and then buried. This is a study, paid for with your HOA dues, that explicitly warned this board that any unpermitted grading or construction in the downstream gully would create a significant and dangerous flood risk. They were informed of the exact danger, in writing, and they chose to ignore it. They built illegally, and they put your homes at risk. A wave of murmurs and angry muttering swept through the crowd. Janice's face was turning pale. Finally, I held up one last piece of paper, a printout of my final email to the board. And fact number 3. I read the key sentence aloud. The dam will be emptied as you requested, effective at 7:15 p.m. Please ensure any residents or property situated downstream are notified accordingly. The board had a legal and moral obligation to warn you. They received this notice. They knew the water was coming. They knew their own construction was in its path. And they said nothing. I placed the email on top of the other documents, creating a small, damning pile of evidence. Then I looked back at the crowd. You fined me $20,000 for hoarding water, I said, my voice rising just enough to fill the auditorium. I followed your written instructions. I gave you the water. Your problem wasn't with me. Your problem was, and is, with gravity. A single person started clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet. A thunderous wave of applause washing over me. It wasn't for me, not really. It was for the truth. It was the sound of a community taking its power back. Janice grabbed the microphone at her seat, her face twisted in a desperate rage. This is an outrage. He's a criminal. He planned this, she shouted, her voice shrill and cracking. He's manipulating all of you. We were only trying to protect this community's property values. She started blaming residents, pointing fingers at people who had challenged her in the past. It was a complete and total meltdown, a desperate, flailing tantrum on a public stage. As she was ranting, a man in the third row stood up. He was a quiet resident, a lawyer who specialized in corporate governance. I'd never spoken to him before. He waited for her to take a breath, and in that small moment of silence, his voice cut through the auditorium, calm and authoritative. Madam President, he said, your personal feelings are not relevant to the business at hand. According to the bylaws, a motion is on the floor. He looked around at the standing, applauding homeowners. I believe it is the clear will of this community that we proceed with the vote. I move to call for the immediate resignation of the entire board of directors. Seconded, a dozen voices shouted at once. The moderator stepped in, taking the microphone from a sputtering Janice. He called for a show of hands. All in favor of the motion to call for the board's immediate resignation? Nearly every hand in the room went up. It was a sea of unified rebellion. All opposed? Janice raised her hand, a lone, trembling gesture of defiance. 2 of her board members kept their hands firmly on the table, their faces ashen. The other 2 reluctantly raised theirs, but it was a pathetic, meaningless gesture. The motion passes, the moderator announced into the microphone. The words hung in the air for a moment. It was over. Janice stared out at the crowd, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend that her authority, the thing she had wielded like a weapon for so long, had simply vanished. She pushed her chair back, stood up on shaky legs, and without another word, she turned and walked off the stage. She didn't look back. It wasn't a triumphant exit. It was the silent, humiliating retreat of a queen, whose castle had just been taken without a single shot fired. The weeks after the flood felt like waking up after a long fever. The air in the neighborhood changed. People started talking to each other again, not in whispers, but out in the open. The fear that Janice had cultivated for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. An interim board was quickly appointed, led by the quiet lawyer who had called for the vote and the retired contractor who had spoken up for me. Their first order of business was to hire an independent accounting firm to go through the HOA's books. The county investigation ran its course, and the findings were exactly what everyone expected. Janice Wilmer and her board were found to be grossly negligent. But the audit uncovered something more. It turned out that the less scrupulous contractor they had hired to do the illegal grading was Janice's brother-in-law. They had funneled nearly $100,000 of HOA funds into his failing company for a project that was never approved and had no permits. The fallout was swift and severe. The new interim board, acting on behalf of the homeowners, filed a civil suit against Janice and the other former board members to recoup the damages and the misappropriated funds. Janice Wilmer, the woman who had tried to take my home over a $20,000 fine, was now facing a lawsuit that would likely bankrupt her. I saw her a few weeks later, loading boxes into a moving truck. Her house had been put up for sale. We made eye contact for a moment across the street. There was no anger left in her face, just a hollow, defeated emptiness. She looked away and went back to her boxes. She was just another person broken by her own need for control. The lien on my property was, of course, thrown out. My lawyer advised me to file a countersuit for harassment and damages. We settled out of court. The HOA's insurance company cut me a check for $35,000, more than enough to cover my legal fees and the cost of the upgrades I'd made to the dam. The best part of the settlement, however, wasn't the money. It was the public written apology issued by the new HOA board, formally exonerating me of any wrongdoing and acknowledging that my actions were a direct result of the previous board's unreasonable and illegitimate demands. Justice wasn't just served. It was put on the record for everyone to see. Under the county's supervision, the new board was tasked with cleaning up the mess. They had to pay a hefty fine for the environmental violations and were ordered to fund the complete restoration of the natural stream bed. One of the first calls the new board president made was to me. He asked if I'd be willing to act as an unpaid consultant on the restoration project. "Rick," he said, "you're the only one around here who actually knows how water works. We need your help to do this right." And so, I found myself working alongside the county engineers and the new contractors, a reputable firm this time, designing a series of gentle swales and proper culverts that would handle a 100-year flood without so much as dampening a lawn. We worked together, as neighbors, to heal the land that the old board had so carelessly wounded. Over the next few months, I rebuilt my dam. I re-engaged the gates, and the pond slowly filled again, the water clear and clean. This time, I added something new. Using some of the settlement money, I built a small, sturdy wooden dock that jutted out over the water. I sanded the planks smooth and stained them a dark cedar. At the end of the dock, I mounted a small, hand-carved wooden sign. It had just 2 words on it: Annie's Rest. The place was transformed. The quiet solitude I had first built it for was replaced by something warmer, more alive. On weekends, the neighbors started coming by again. Marty would bring his fishing gear, and we'd sit on the dock for hours, not saying much, just enjoying the peace. Other families would bring their kids, their bright laughter echoing across the water as they tried to catch the little bluegill that swam in the shallows. A couple of guys from the local VFW, hearing the story, started dropping by on Saturday afternoons with a cooler of beer, and we'd trade stories that had nothing to do with HOAs or lawsuits. One evening, I was sitting on the dock by myself, watching the sun set. The water was like glass, reflecting the deep purples and oranges of the sky. A young couple who had just moved into one of the repaired homes walked down the path holding hands. They paused, looking at the pond. "Are you Mr. McAllister?" the young man asked. I nodded. "We just wanted to say thank you," his wife said. "What you did, it made this a community again." They didn't stay long, but their words stuck with me. They were right. The water had washed away more than just the dirt and the shoddy retaining walls. It had washed away the hostility, the petty tyranny, the fear. It had cleared the ground for something better to grow. They said I was hoarding water, but the truth is, Janice was the one hoarding something. She was hoarding control, hoarding power. The water didn't destroy anything that wasn't already broken. It just reminded everyone who really owns the land, not the people who write the rules, but the people who care for it.